Alexander Kane has built an empire brick by brick, conquering boardrooms and bending markets to his will. But when his bright-eyed little girl asks for something his wealth can't simply provide, he sets out on a journey that will test his heart in ways no deal ever has, and lead him somewhere he never expected to go. Hello family, welcome to Storytime with Imzi. Please subscribe and like, it means the world to us. Also share this video to your friends and loved ones and turn on post notifications so you don't miss future videos from us. Thank you as you do so. Sit back and relax as we dive into the story. The smell of warm pancakes drifted through the glass-walled kitchen, mingling with the faint hum of the city far below. Sunlight spilled across the marble countertop, glinting off the syrup bottle Sophie was gripping with both hands. Alexander Kane, dressed in his weekend hoodie instead of a suit for once, leaned over the stove to flip the last pancake onto a plate. He placed it in front of his daughter, sliding the fork toward her. "Extra blueberries, just like you like," he said with a proud smile. Sophie beamed, her puffball ponytails bobbing as she dug in. For a few quiet moments, only the clink of her fork and the occasional soft mmm filled the room. Then she stopped, fork frozen midair. "Daddy." Alexander, mid-sip of coffee, glanced up. "Yeah, sweetheart." Her big brown eyes searched his face with the kind of seriousness only a 6-year-old could muster. "Why don't I have a mommy?" The question landed in the space between them like a glass dropped on tile, sudden, sharp, and impossible to ignore. Alexander's hand tightened around his mug. "What do you mean?" he asked softly, buying time. Sophie shrugged, looking down at her plate. "At school, Mia's mommy picked her up yesterday, and Jaden's mommy came for lunch last week. Everyone's got one. Except me." She stabbed a blueberry like it had personally offended her. "I want one too." Alexander felt a pinch in his chest, the kind that no amount of business wins or bank accounts could fix. The city skyline outside the window blurred for a moment as his thoughts scattered. He reached across the table, his large hand resting over her small one. "Sophie." His voice was steady, but there was a weight behind it. "That's a really important question." She tilted her head. "So, can we get one?" Alexander almost laughed, but the sincerity in her face stopped him. She wasn't asking for a toy or a trip. This was bigger. "Sweetheart," he said slowly, "mommies aren't something you just pick out. They're someone special." Sophie's brows knitted together, as if she were trying to solve a puzzle. Then she smiled faintly, like she'd already decided something in her head. "Okay, but can we at least look?" And for the first time in a long while, Alexander didn't have a ready answer. That night, the penthouse was quiet. Too quiet. Alexander sat alone in his study, the city's lights stretching endlessly beyond the floor-to-ceiling windows. The faint tick of the wall clock was the only sound, steady and unbothered, like time itself had no care for the way his mind was circling. On the desk in front of him sat a single photograph. Sophie was a newborn in it, swaddled in a hospital blanket, her tiny face scrunched up in protest at the world. Beside her, smiling brighter than the morning sun, was Maya, his college sweetheart, his wife, his only love. Gone far too soon. He ran a thumb over the glass, tracing the curve of Maya's smile. The ache was familiar, but tonight it was sharper, pulled to the surface by 6 innocent words. "Why don't I have a mommy?" Alexander leaned back in his leather chair, exhaling slowly. He had built empires, turned struggling companies into industry giants, negotiated with people twice his age when he was barely out of his 20s. But none of that had prepared him for the look in Sophie's eyes this morning. Hopeful, confused, maybe even a little sad. A knock at the door broke the silence. "Come in," he called. George stepped inside, holding a steaming mug. He was more than a chef. He'd been with Alexander since his first apartment, back when money was tight and the fridge was usually empty. Over the years, he'd become part of the family. "Chamomile," George said, setting the mug down. "You look like you're thinking too hard again." Alexander gave him a tired half-smile. "Sophie asked me something today." George raised a brow. "About?" "She wants to know why she doesn't have a mother." George didn't react with surprise. Instead, he sank into the chair across from him and folded his hands. "She's getting older." "It's a fair question." Alexander stared into the tea, the steam curling upward like it was carrying his thoughts away. I don't want her to feel like she's missing something." George's voice was gentle. Maybe she is. That hit harder than expected. Alexander leaned forward, elbows on his knees. What if I can't give her that? What if no one could be enough? George's lips curved into a knowing smile. You're thinking like a businessman again, worrying about the perfect fit. This isn't a merger, Alex. It's love. You don't find it on paper, you find it in life. Alexander sat back, the weight of the words settling on him. Maybe George was right. Maybe it wasn't about finding the perfect mother figure, but the right person to love Sophie as much as he did. He glanced at the photo again, the ache still there. But this time, a flicker of something else joined it. Resolve. Sunday morning brought the smell of cinnamon and the sound of laughter from the kitchen. Sophie was perched on one of the high stools, swinging her legs and humming some tune she'd probably made up on the spot. A plate of French toast sat in front of her, syrup pooled like a little golden lake. Alexander, still in his t-shirt and sweatpants, leaned against the counter with a coffee in hand. The heaviness from the night before had lifted, if only a little. Sophie was in full chatter mode. So, I was thinking, she began between bites, if we're going to look for a mommy, we need a plan. Alexander raised an eyebrow. A plan, huh? Yeah, she said matter-of-factly, hopping down from the stool. You can't just go pick any mommy. She's got to be perfect. He chuckled. Perfect's a tall order, Sophie. Not if we make a list. She dashed to the living room, grabbing a stack of bright pink paper and her set of glitter gel pens. She plopped back down at the counter and started writing, tongue poking out in concentration. Alexander watched, curious. After a few minutes, she held up the page for him to see. Letters big and uneven, little stars doodled in the corners. Sophie's mommy list. Reads bedtime stories in funny voices. Can braid hair without pulling. Makes really good pancakes. Loves me more than daddy's cars. Laughs a lot. Alexander couldn't help it. He laughed, the sound genuine and light. That's actually a pretty good list. Sophie grinned proudly. See, this way we don't waste time on the wrong ones. He took the paper from her, reading it again. Her handwriting was messy, but the meaning was clear. This wasn't about him finding a wife. It was about finding someone who would fill a space in Sophie's heart he couldn't reach on his own. And in that moment, Alexander decided. They were going to try. By Monday morning, Alexander had already made up his mind. If they were going to do this, he was going to do it properly. Of course, in Alexander Kane fashion. Properly meant creating a spreadsheet. Sophie sat on the couch, peering over his shoulder at the laptop. Why are there boxes and lines? So I can keep track, he explained. Names, interests, whether they meet your criteria. Sophie wrinkled her nose. That's boring. I'm just going to say yes or no. And that's how the vetting process began. Candidate 1, a glamorous R&B singer with a voice like velvet and an Instagram following bigger than some small countries. She arrived at their favorite downtown restaurant wearing sunglasses, indoors. Sophie eyed her suspiciously. By the time dessert came, the woman hadn't asked Sophie a single question, though she had taken 3 selfies. In the car afterward, Sophie's verdict was blunt. She smells nice, but she's not mommy material. X on the list. Candidate 2, a powerhouse corporate attorney who shook Sophie's hand like she was closing $1 million deal. Halfway through lunch, she pulled out a notepad. So, Sophie, where do you see yourself in 10 years? Sophie blinked. A second grade? Big X. Candidate 3, a lifestyle influencer who arrived with a cameraman and immediately asked if they could stage a cute pancake breakfast for content. Sophie crossed her arms and whispered to her dad, She's just here for the cars, Daddy. X so big it ripped the paper. By the end of the week, Alexander was starting to wonder if they were being too picky. Sophie didn't think so. Daddy, she said one night, sprawled on the couch, if we have to meet 100 people, we will. Mommies are important. Alexander looked at her, small but fierce, serious but sweet, and decided that yes, maybe they would meet 100 people. Because for Sophie, it would be worth it. Rain had a way of slowing the city down, softening the usual rush into something quieter. Alexander didn't mind. It gave him an excuse to walk instead of taking the car. He'd been in back-to-back meetings all morning, his mind tangled in contracts and numbers, when the drizzle turned into a downpour. Sophie tugged at his hand. Daddy, my shoes are making the squishy noise. He He looked down. Sure enough, her pink sneakers were soaked. "All right, let's get you dry." They ducked into the first open doorway they saw, a narrow little bookstore tucked between a coffee shop and a florist. The place smelled like paper and rain, the air warm and inviting. Tall shelves lined the walls, and the faint sound of jazz played from somewhere in the back. Sophie's eyes went wide. "Books," she squealed, immediately wandering toward the children's section. Alexander followed more slowly, shaking the rain from his jacket. That's when he saw her. Emma Brooks was crouched on the floor beside a little boy who looked about 5. She was holding 2 books in her hands, her curly hair pulled into a loose bun, a few strands framing her face. Her voice was soft but animated. "Okay, Jamal," she said, "this one has dinosaurs who bake cookies, and this one has a squirrel who learns karate. Which do you think sounds more fun?" The boy giggled. "Karate squirrel." Emma laughed, a warm, genuine sound that seemed to reach into every corner of the room. She handed him the book and ruffled his hair before standing up. Her eyes met Alexander's. "Can I help you find something?" For a second, he forgot how to speak. Maybe something for a 6-year-old who likes glitter and pancakes?" Sophie appeared at his side at that exact moment, clutching a picture book with a rainbow unicorn on the cover. "Daddy, can I get this one?" "Oh, hi." Emma's smile softened as she knelt to Sophie's level. "That's a good choice. You know, I have another one in that series where the unicorn learns how to cook breakfast." Sophie gasped. "Pancakes?" "Of course," Emma said with a wink. And just like that, Sophie was sitting cross-legged on the carpet, flipping through books with Emma like they'd known each other forever. Alexander stood a few steps away, watching them, a strange feeling creeping into his chest. Something warm. Something familiar. He didn't know it yet, but this rainy afternoon was about to change everything. It started small. A week after the bookstore, Emma dropped by their penthouse to deliver the Unicorn Learns to Cook Breakfast book she'd promised Sophie. She could have mailed it. She could have sent a message. But instead, she showed up in person, holding a paper bag that smelled suspiciously like vanilla. "I figured the unicorn shouldn't be the only one making pancakes," she said, handing the bag to Sophie. Inside were 3 golden, still-warm pancakes wrapped in wax paper. From then on, Emma seemed to weave her way into their days without forcing it. On Saturday mornings, she joined them for breakfast, letting Sophie pour the syrup even when it dripped onto the table. On sunny afternoons, she met them at the park, sitting on the grass with Sophie while Alexander watched from a bench, the sound of their laughter floating through the air. One Sunday, Alexander invited her to dinner at his mother's house. He expected politeness and a bit of small talk. What he got was Emma in the kitchen, laughing with his mother over a pot of collard greens, sleeves rolled up as if she'd been part of the family for years. Sophie hovered close, clearly delighted that her mommy candidate could keep up with Grandma Kane's cooking. The moments piled up like puzzle pieces, each one fitting perfectly into the picture Sophie had drawn on that bright pink paper. "Bedtime stories?" Emma read with voices so silly Sophie laughed until she hiccuped. "Braiding hair without pulling?" Emma had skills, though she always added a colorful ribbon at the end for extra sparkle. "Pancakes?" She made them light and fluffy, with chocolate chips shaped like hearts. Laughing a lot. That one wasn't even a question anymore. One night, after Emma had left, Alexander found Sophie in her room, adding a glittery checkmark next to each item on the list. She paused at the last one, "Loves me more than Daddy's cars," and looked up. "I think she does," Sophie whispered, smiling. Alexander didn't answer right away. He just watched his daughter's happiness spilling over like syrup on a plate, wondering when exactly Emma had become not just part of their days, but part of their lives. It was late, the kind of quiet where the city outside felt far away. Alexander was in his study, laptop open but untouched, a contract on the screen he couldn't bring himself to read. His mind kept drifting, to the way Emma's laughter had filled the penthouse earlier that evening, to Sophie leaning against her during movie night, eyes heavy with sleep. Emma had carried her to bed, humming softly all the way down the hall. The knock on his door was so light he almost didn't hear it. "Come in," he said. Sophie slipped inside, wearing her fuzzy pink socks and holding a piece of paper. She walked right up to his desk, set the paper down, and stood there in silence. It was the list. Every box was checked, glittery stars in some corners, bold swirls in others. Alexander looked up at her. You've been keeping track. She nodded. Uh-huh. And, he prompted. Sophie took a deep breath, her voice barely above a whisper. Daddy, can we keep her? The words were so simple, so sure, that for a moment Alexander couldn't speak. She said it like Emma was a puppy they'd found in the rain, like keeping her was the only thing that made sense. Sweetheart, he said softly, she's not a pet. I know, Sophie replied, climbing into his lap. But she's ours. I feel it. He wrapped his arms around her, feeling the steady beat of her little heart against his chest. And in that moment, he knew Sophie was right. Emma wasn't just a guest in their lives anymore. She was part of them, woven in like she'd been there all along. Alexander kissed the top of Sophie's head, the decision already made before he even admitted it to himself. Yeah, he murmured. I think we can keep her. The little bookstore was just as it had been that rainy day months ago. Warm light spilling across the shelves, the faint sound of jazz in the background, and that comforting scent of paper and coffee. Emma was there, sorting a stack of new arrivals, her curls falling into her face as she read the back of a hardcover. She didn't hear Alexander come in. Sophie did, though. She peeked out from behind the mystery section, a mischievous grin on her face and something small clasped in her hands. Ready, Alexander whispered. Sophie nodded, clutching the velvet ring box a little tighter. Together, they walked toward Emma. She looked up at the sound of footsteps, her smile breaking out instantly. Hey, you two. Here for another pancake unicorn book. Not exactly, Alexander said, his voice warm. Emma tilted her head. Oh, he took the ring box from Sophie, but kept his daughter close at his side. That day we met here. I had no idea you were about to change our lives. You've made Sophie's laughter louder. You've made our home warmer. And you've made me, he paused, his throat tight. You've made me believe in family again. Emma's eyes glistened, her hand pressed to her mouth. Alexander dropped to one knee, his other arm still around Sophie. So, will you marry us? Sophie bounced on her toes. Yeah, you have to say yes, 'cause we already decided we're keeping you. Emma laughed through her tears, the sound rich and full, and nodded. Yes, 1,000 times yes. Months later, the three of them stood in a sunlit room filled with flowers and music. Alexander waited at the altar, his suit sharp but his smile softer than anyone had ever seen it. Emma entered, her eyes locked on him. And right between them, walking proudly down the aisle in her white puffball dress, was Sophie, holding both their hands like she was guiding them into their future. When the vows were said and the kiss sealed the promise, Sophie leaned in between them, grinning. Told you we should keep her. Alexander and Emma laughed, and the sound was the kind of joy you didn't just hear, you felt.